France. June 1944. Rain turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. We walked in silence, boots sinking, cuffs biting into swollen wrists. The column stretched ahead through the gray, women in torn uniforms, faces hollow from sleepless nights and powdered rations. I was the last in line. The bruise around my wrist had turned blue, like a mark left by the sky itself. Behind us, the thunder of artillery, distant, rhythmic. Ahead, an American truck idled by the roadside, its flag soaked and heavy with rain. A soldier handed a prisoner a tin cup of water. She drank. He didn't stop her. I remember thinking, why didn't they finish us off? Why are they giving us water? Everything I had been told about the enemy was about to come apart. They said we would be processed according to the Geneva Convention. The phrase sounded like a switch being thrown somewhere far above the mud and the rain, a mechanism that would keep hands from striking faces and rifles from firing into a line of prisoners. I did not trust mechanisms anymore. Still, the Americans walked beside us without shouting. Their sergeant counted heads as if we were freight that could breathe. I learned his name from a scrap of talk between guards, Sergeant Ben Harper, 36th Infantry Division. A man with a dry voice and an untorn field jacket. He kept a small notebook in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth. He watched us the way a telegrapher watches a needle, steady, measuring, trained to see the flicker no one else notices. When a girl stumbled, he raised his hand, and the column halted long enough for her to stand. The order carried no drama. It was simply, done. Regulation traveled with us, folded papers, stamped rules. No cruelty. No humiliation. The words were older than the road and cleaner than the boots that trod it. Yet the men were not ruled by paper alone. I saw tiredness the color of old smoke in their faces. Their friends were gone into the ground or into the sea, and we wore the uniform that had put them there. Some eyes slid past us as if we were fog. Others held too long, as if weight were being moved inside a man and he could not set it down. We had our own rules, learned in small rooms with black curtains. Americans are savages, the voice on the wireless had said. They will use you, then shoot you. I had repeated that sentence once to calm a younger operator, like a nurse repeating a dosage. Now I heard the click of canteens and saw water given without a word. Lies corrode slowly, you feel the metal thinning before it breaks. Harper walked near the middle of the file. He spoke softly to his men, never to us, except once. A storm gusted across the road and slammed grit into our eyes. I blinked blindly and veered toward a ditch. His hand caught my elbow for the length of a heartbeat and corrected my line. Nothing more. The touch was exact, machine true, not unkind. I thought of a wrench settling onto a nut, turning only as far as needed. At halts, he took bearings, marked times, lit a cigarette only after his men had eaten. When the truck's flag tangled on its own wet rope, he freed it with the patience of a man untying a wire from a finicky antenna. Discipline, I realized, is not loud. It is a rhythm, count, check, release. Behind that rhythm lay the system, capture, questioning, transport, names entered in ledgers, women separated from men, the long Atlantic, then camps that were said to be safe. I had entered too many rooms marked authorized personnel only, to believe any system was gentle by design. But I could not ignore the evidence of small, precise mercies. A blanket passed forward. A tin cup refilled. A guard who stood with his back to us while we used the ditch so that dignity might survive one more mile. Frida muttered that kindness was a net, that the fish swims easier when it stops fighting. Perhaps. Nets are still nets. Yet as La Rochelle fell behind and the road widened toward the port, I heard a sentence forming in my head like a message keyed slowly across a wire: the enemy is not always the man, sometimes the enemy is the lesson about the man. That night, in a shed that smelled of rope and wet timber, I listened to rain on the tin roof and to the Americans laughing in the yard, low and exhausted. Someone played a few notes on a harmonica, broken phrases that didn't resolve. I kept still, counting the beats between notes the way I once counted the gaps in static for a clean transmit. Somewhere in that counting, I understood what was being tested, not their rules, but mine. Before uniforms, before maps and passwords and the cold language of war, there had been letters. Stacks of them, neat as tiles, moving through the Leipzig post office like blood through a heart. I worked the telegraph desk, for years before the war began. The room smelled of ink and ozone, of wire warmed by current. The tick of the key was steady and comforting, each pulse a certainty that distance could be bridged by order. I liked order. I liked how messages obeyed. Words entered, dots and dashes left, the pattern exact every time. Outside, trams clattered and the city moved in gray rhythm, but inside the hall everything was measured, predictable, almost kind. If a line failed, I could hear it before the gauge showed red, the slight hitch, the false resonance of metal talking to itself. My supervisor called it an ear for the current. I thought of it simply as listening properly. In those days, I believed neatness was a kind of morality. If you did everything right, checked, signed, delivered, life would remain intact, like paper that never tears. When my brother Hans was conscripted in 1939, I wrote him each week. I wrote not about courage but about machines, the new sorting equipment, the typewriter that stuck on the letter R, the smell of glue after rain. He replied from Poland, then from somewhere near Smolensk. His handwriting grew smaller, as if trying to hide. By 1942, the war had seeped into everything. The post office wore blackout curtains, the messages were censored, stamped with eagle seals. I was transferred to a Luftwaffe communications unit because I could send Morse faster than regulation speed. They called us Helferinnen, helpers. A clean word, almost domestic. We wore blue-gray skirts and carried codebooks instead of rifles. Our station sat on the edge of an airfield near Leipzig-Machau. From the barracks windows, I could see Messerschmitts lift through morning fog, silver wings slicing the air. The ground trembled when they rose. I admired their precision more than their purpose. Pilots saluted, we answered by key. Their voices came to us through the static, distant, metallic, sometimes frightened. Bearing lost. Fuel low. Engaged, 1 minute. We logged each call, even the last ones that ended mid-syllable. In 1943, during an inspection, an officer asked why I never looked away from the receiver when a plane went silent. I told him silence had a pattern too. He frowned, said I was sentimental. Perhaps I was. Sentiment, after all, is just memory that refuses to obey orders. When Leipzig was bombed, the post office vanished in a single night. My father's shop followed. Afterward, the airfield was our only world, runways, radios, rules. I kept my uniform pressed, my shoes polished. I told myself that order was still possible, that if the circuits remained intact, so would I. Yet small things began to betray the illusion, engines returning late, fewer voices on the line, gaps in the shift roster that no one filled. In early 1944, Hans's final letter reached me through military channels. The envelope was thin, the paper stiff with dust. Do everything right, he wrote, and maybe the world will right itself with you. The ink had bled where his hand must have shaken. I read it until the creases turned white. Months later, when American bombers roared overhead and the sirens failed to sound, I realized correctness could not protect anyone. Circuits burn, messages fade, and the neatest handwriting ends in smoke. When the order came to evacuate communications personnel westward, I packed my codebook, the telegraph key I had repaired myself, and one photograph, Hans in uniform, smiling like someone who believed the instructions still mattered. By June, we were on the road to La Rochelle, scattered fragments of a broken signal still trying to transmit meaning through the static of defeat. I no longer believed the pattern could be restored, but I kept sending it anyway. Because to stop would mean admitting that silence had won. The ocean had no edges, only motion and noise. We were placed in the hold of a Liberty ship, 30 women, one narrow hatch, a wooden ladder slick with salt. The air was a blend of diesel, sweat, and the slow rusting of metal. Each day, the Americans opened the hatch for air and counted us. Each day, I waited for the cruelty that had been promised. It never arrived. The guards spoke little German, only gestures, 2 fingers for food, a hand to the chest for water. They were not gentle, but they were not cruel. When one girl fainted from seasickness, they passed down a tin of fruit and let her keep the spoon. I remember watching that small act like a message keyed through static, uncertain, fragile, but real. At night the ship groaned. The Atlantic hammered the hull, and the bolts dripped condensation onto our blankets. Frida whispered that the Americans were pretending. They give kindness, she said, so that we forget what we are. Then they will use us. I wanted to believe her. Anger is easier to carry than doubt. But the facts disagreed. When the weather turned cold, they brought extra blankets. When the food spoiled, they threw it overboard and shared their own rations, hard biscuits, coffee, sugar. The same food they ate themselves. I learned the sound of their shift bells, the pattern of boots above our heads, the way laughter echoed differently from discipline. One evening, a storm rolled across the sea. Lightning burst against the waves like artillery. The ship pitched hard, boxes slid. A young auxiliary named Marta was too weak to climb the ladder for air. The guards hesitated. Rules forbade prisoners from reaching the deck during heavy weather. Then one of them broke the rule. He climbed down himself, lifted her by the arms, and carried her up into the rain. She stood beneath the storm, breathing greedily, her hair plastered to her face. The soldier stayed beside her, soaked to the skin, steady as a post. No one spoke. He could have been any man, on any side, doing the single correct thing when orders failed to cover it. Below deck, Frida hissed at me, "You see? He wants something." I answered nothing. The question inside me was larger than her suspicion. What if he didn't? Days blurred. The sound of engines replaced the rhythm of sleep. I began to chart the ship's noises the way I once charted signal pulses, 3 tones for the winches, 2 for the anchor chain, 1 low growl when the rudder fought the current. Structure calmed me. Even in captivity, I needed a system. The Americans, I noticed, followed theirs with the same precision I once admired in our own. Only their system left room for anomaly, mercy, deviation, the human variable that ruins perfect equations. When the storm passed, the sky cleared to a hard, clean blue. The sea reflected it so precisely that the horizon disappeared. For hours, it felt as though we were suspended between 2 mirrors. Some of the women prayed. Others stared at the water as if it might offer explanation. I found myself thinking of the telegraph hall back in Leipzig, the certainty of signal, the obedience of machines. Here, nothing obeyed. The world was vast, disordered, and yet somehow still functioning. On the 7th morning, sunlight reached the hold. The hatch opened wide, flooding the space with gold light. A guard waved us up for fresh air. I climbed slowly, each rung a protest from stiff muscles. When my head broke the surface, wind hit my face, salt, clean, alive. For a moment, I forgot the war entirely. I looked toward the horizon and saw another ship, white against the glare. Between us and it, gulls hovered, wings cutting through brightness. The guard who had carried Marta stood near the railing, cap pushed back, eyes half closed against the light. He noticed me watching and nodded once, neither friendly nor formal, just a recognition of existence. I should have looked away. I didn't. That evening, Frida whispered again, "They are actors. When we reach America, the masks will fall." But a thought had already lodged inside me, stubborn as rust in wire. What if the mask was ours? What if the real fiction was everything we'd been told about them? The sea answered with silence. And in that silence, the first fracture opened between belief and reality. Texas announced itself through heat and distance. After weeks of gray sea and regulated movement, the horizon opened into light, unbroken, absolute. The train from the port roared through fields the color of brass. Dust filmed the windows, the air smelled of creosote and wheat. Inside our car, 40 women sat on wooden benches, each holding a paper tag with a number and a camp designation. Mine read Fort Livingston, POW AUX/44. We had expected the end of the world. Instead, the landscape kept unfolding. At noon the train slowed, brakes shrieking against the rails. The guards stood, checking rifles, sweat darkening the seams of their uniforms. Through the window I saw a boy on a platform selling lemonade in glass jars. A banner hung from the depot roof, "Welcome to Texas." It looked absurd, like stage scenery for someone else's life. Then I stepped out, and sound changed. The cicadas sang in every direction, the heat thick as breath. The prisoners ahead of me shielded their eyes, expecting shouting, perhaps G*NS. None came. Instead, the same sergeant from the ship, Harper, walked down the line with a clipboard and said, almost politely, "Single file, ladies. Shades this way." The phrase caught on the air like music from another planet. We walked toward the trucks. Soldiers loaded our small cases, no one pushed, no one cursed. A woman behind me began to cry quietly, as if the lack of cruelty was the final indignity. I understood. After years of fear, kindness can feel like mockery. The convoy rattled through low hills. Sunlight burned the edges of everything, fences, windmills, a lone steeple on the horizon. The fields were vast, stitched with barbed wire and wild sunflowers. Somewhere, a windmill creaked in rhythm with the truck's suspension. I watched Harper ride ahead in a jeep, hat off, hair whipped by dust. His posture was straight, his gestures precise. Even in the heat, the man operated like a metronome set to a tempo no one else could hear. When we reached the camp, I braced for the smell of rotten metal. Instead, there was fresh bread, yeast, warm, real. The kitchen stood whitewashed, the barracks numbered in neat rows. American soldiers worked the gates, their rifles slung low. I saw one offer a cigarette to another, laughing. In that moment I felt a kind of vertigo. The world had inverted, and I could not tell which side of the wire defined captivity. That night, after registration and inspection, they allowed us into the yard. The sun had dropped, leaving a copper glow across the fences. From a nearby farmhouse came the muffled sound of a radio, jazz, soft, almost sorrowful. I leaned against the wall, listening. Frida muttered that it was propaganda, that they wanted us to forget who we were. But I no longer knew who that was supposed to be. For months I had been told that the enemy was faceless, mechanical, incapable of mercy. Yet these men laughed, argued about baseball, and handed us cups of water without looking for reward. If this was savagery, it was strangely disciplined. Later, as darkness thickened, Harper walked past our barracks, checking locks. His steps were deliberate, heel then toe, as if each sound mattered. When he reached our door, he paused and looked inside. The lamplight struck his face, dust, stubble, eyes the color of worn metal. He said one sentence, "You'll get new clothes tomorrow." Then he moved on. It was nothing, a routine notice. But the tone, flat, factual, contained no contempt. Only procedure. And in that simplicity was the beginning of release. I lay awake long after the lights were cut. Crickets pulsed through the night like Morse code, steady and infinite. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked once and fell silent. I thought of Leipzig, of the smell of ink and the neat rows of telegraph keys. I thought of Hans, buried in a field whose coordinates I would never know. Then I thought of that boy on the station platform holding a glass of lemonade to the sun. The world I had built from rules had melted in the Texas heat. What remained was something uncharted, almost unbearable in its quietness. For the first time in months, fear left my body like a breath I had been holding since Europe. I understood that survival might depend not on obedience, but on curiosity. And a thought, dangerous, clear, came and stayed. Perhaps the real enemy is not the man with the rifle, but the idea I was told to believe about him. By October, the Texas air softened. Mornings carried the smell of hay and dew instead of dust. At Fort Livingston, the fences seemed less like boundaries and more like lines drawn on a map that no longer matched the terrain. Each day I worked at the Miller farm, one of several local properties that requested labor from the camp. The rulebook was clear: no conversation with civilians, no exchange of gifts, no gestures beyond necessity. They issued us khaki work clothes, plain and shapeless, marked PW in black paint. We rode out in trucks before dawn, 6 women and a guard. The countryside blurred past in bands of ochre and green. Cows stood motionless in the fields like monuments. The world here was huge and indifferent. The Millers were an old couple, both quiet, practical, exact in their habits. They treated us as they treated their animals, with an impersonal decency that neither humiliated nor flattered. Mrs. Miller supervised the dairy, Mr. Miller repaired fences and tractors. Their son, Tom, was 20, maybe 21, too young for the Pacific draft, though his friends had gone. He moved with the lazy precision of someone raised around machines, slow until the moment precision was required. At first, he barely looked at us. We loaded hay, scrubbed troughs, cleaned stalls. The rhythm suited me. Work was a form of prayer, repeat until silence. The guard, a corporal named Dawson, read newspapers under the pecan tree. We were considered harmless. Then the horse broke loose. It was late afternoon. The wind carried a storm scent, ozone, electricity. I was hauling a bucket when the young stallion spooked at thunder and snapped his tether. He bolted through the open gate, dragging rope. Dawson shouted but didn't move fast enough. Instinct pushed me before thought. I ran into the field, boots sinking in mud, shouting the German word for stop that meant nothing to anyone but me. The horse veered toward the fence, wild-eyed. Tom came from the opposite side, a shadow against the lightning. We closed on the animal from both flanks, a silent geometry of motion, two people who had never spoken, guided by the same urgency. He grabbed the rope as it whipped past and planted his heels. I caught the halter. For a moment, all motion froze, the horse trembling between us, our hands slick with rain and breath. Then it calmed. The storm moved east. When we led the animal back, Dawson said nothing. The rules didn't cover the weather. That evening, we were late returning to the camp. The sky burned red behind the hills. The truck smelled of wet leather. I sat opposite Tom. He looked at the horsehair still clinging to my sleeve and said, "Good catch." His accent flattened the vowels, the words sounded carved, not spoken. I answered automatically, "Danke." He smiled as if the sound of another language was a puzzle solved. That was all, 2 syllables traded across regulation. The next night, as the guard counted us into the barn to finish sorting feed, I heard a faint tune outside, a harmonica, tentative, uncertain. The melody rose and fell like a question without translation. I looked through the gap in the boards. Tom sat on the fence rail, playing to no one, eyes fixed on the dark fields. When he noticed me, he lowered the instrument slightly and nodded once, not invitation, not defiance, just recognition. I should have turned away. The manual was explicit, no communication with civilians beyond assigned tasks. But something in the silence demanded an answer. I lifted my hand, barely emotion, more reflex than rebellion. He smiled, continued the tune, slow and low. That gesture was a crack in the structure. After that night, the days changed imperceptibly. He would set aside tools where I could reach them without asking. I would leave the barn door unlatched so the wind could move through. We never spoke beyond necessity, but language accumulated in smaller ways, the direction of a glance, the pause before parting. I told myself it was harmless, an engineer's curiosity about cause and effect. If a smile breaks a rule, what else might it repair? By November, frost silvered the pastures. The cotton fields stood bare. One morning, Tom handed me a cup of coffee when the guard wasn't watching. "It's too cold for water," he said. The coffee was bitter and burnt, but it tasted alive. I knew then that I had crossed the line completely. The line didn't punish me, it disappeared. Every empire of rules ends the same way, not with rebellion, but with a small human correction. That night, lying on my bunk, I stared at the ceiling's rough boards, counting the breaths of the women around me. Beyond the wire, a harmonica played again, softer this time, almost lost to wind. And for the first time since the war began, I didn't feel like a prisoner or a soldier. Just someone who had chosen to look back when the music started. January 1945. The Texas sky turned iron gray, and the wind carried the smell of rain and clay. For weeks the horizon had been quiet, no trucks from the base, no drills, only the drone of winter insects and the far-off creak of barns adjusting to cold. The war in Europe was still burning, but here it felt remote, like static at the edge of a frequency. Then the storm came. It started with thunder the color of brass. By dusk, rain had become a wall, heavy enough to bend the trees. Lightning flickered over the Miller farm, showing fields already drowned. The creek that bordered the pasture had swollen into a river, its current tugging at the fence posts. Inside the barn, the animals kicked and bellowed, the smell of panic filled the air. The guards at the work detail shouted orders, evacuate the prisoners to higher ground. Regulations were clear, property could be replaced, prisoners could not. But when I saw the water breaking through the gate and the cattle trapped against the far wall, the logic of the order dissolved. I thought of Tom, outside in the rain, running toward the corrals with only a lantern and rope. He was shouting for his father, the sound lost in the wind. The guard hesitated, waiting for the truck. I didn't. I waded into the yard, the mud *king at my boots, the cold slicing through the thin fabric of my jacket. Someone yelled my number, maybe to stop me, maybe to count me, but the words vanished in the storm. The barn doors were jammed with debris. I climbed through a window, glass biting my palms. Inside, the cattle pressed together, eyes white with fear. The roof groaned under the wind. Tom was there, soaked to the skin, trying to cut the rope from a gate half under water. His knife slipped. I reached for the other end, pulling until the knot gave. The gate swung open, the animal surging out into the field, dark shapes against lightning. "Get out," he shouted, but I couldn't hear where "out" was. Water rose past my knees. The floorboards creaked. I grabbed his arm, pointed toward the loft ladder. We climbed just as the lower wall collapsed, boards exploding under the force. For a second, the world was only noise, rain, wood, the metallic scream of nails giving way. Then stillness, except for the hiss of water below. We sat in the rafters, breathing hard. His lantern had gone out, only the storm gave light. I could see his face, drawn tight, streaked with mud. He looked at me and said, half laughing, half shaking, "You don't follow orders very well." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that the wind wouldn't take. By dawn, the storm passed. The air was clear and cold, the kind of cold that burns the lungs. The yard was unrecognizable, mud plains, fences down, the barn's lower walls gone. But the animals had survived. So had we. When the guards arrived with trucks, they found me standing beside Tom, both of us covered in mud, the remains of the gate rope still wound around my wrist. The corporal stared, speechless. Then Harper appeared, the same calm posture, clipboard in hand. His eyes flicked from Tom to me to the wreckage. "You disobeyed evacuation protocol," he said finally. "Yes," I answered. My voice surprised me, it was steady. He nodded once, wrote something on the paper, and walked away without another word. That afternoon, rumors spread through the camp, a German girl had stayed behind and saved an American farm. The story grew with each telling, that I had pulled animals from the flood one by one, that I had dragged the farmer's son from the current, that I had prayed aloud in German while the storm broke the fences. None of it mattered. What mattered was that something in the air changed. Guards who had never looked at us directly now nodded in passing. The miller sent fresh bread to the camp kitchen, for the helpers. No one said hero. No one said friend. But the line between captive and free had shifted, imperceptibly, like a current altering course. That night, Harper visited the barracks. He stood at the door, the light from the corridor cutting across the floor. "You'll stay on farm duty," he said. "They asked for you by name." I nodded. When he left, Frida whispered, "You think this will save you?" I looked at my hands, scratched, blistered, smelling of rain and hay. "No," I said quietly. "It saved something else." Outside, the air was silent after so much noise. Somewhere in the distance, the harmonica played again, slower, uncertain, but alive. Rules had failed. And because they failed, something human had managed to survive. May 1945. Germany surrendered, and with it came an order written in precise black ink, all prisoners of war to be repatriated at the earliest logistical convenience. Words cold enough to fit in a telegram, too clean to carry the noise of what they meant. The camps buzzed with sudden movement, lists updated, trunks inspected, uniforms reissued with patches removed. Freedom, on paper, had arrived. For many, it was celebration. For others, confusion. After 2 years in Texas, the fences had become the edges of a familiar world. Outside waited a country we had only imagined. Inside were routines that now felt like home. The guards no longer carried rifles during roll call. The mess hall served cake for Victory Day. The radio played Sentimental Journey, its melody half hope, half lament. Harper walked the perimeter one last time, his boots tracing the same path he had taken every morning for months. I saw him stop at the west gate, fold his clipboard under his arm, and look toward the horizon. He was leaving too, assigned back to a unit bound for Europe. The war had emptied him of something I couldn't name but recognized, the quiet after purpose. The night before our transport, Tom Miller came to the fence. It was late, the floodlights dimmed, the sky bruised with the last heat of spring. He carried a paper bag that smelled of bread and oil. I met him halfway between the guard posts, where the wire sagged slightly from age. We didn't touch the fence, even in peace, its hum of tension remained. "They're sending you home tomorrow," he said. I nodded. "That's what they call it." He looked down at the bag. "My mother baked these. She said you saved more than the cattle." I wanted to answer, but language failed. He handed the bag through the wire. I took it, the paper warm against my hands. Then, quietly, he said, "If you ever can, come back." The phrase struck harder than any command I'd ever received. Come back. Not return, not visit, words without duty attached. When the trucks arrived at dawn, the camp stood assembled by nationality. Flags hung limp in the windless air. Harper read names, his voice steady, impersonal. When he reached mine, our eyes met only for a second. He gave a brief nod, official, final. We drove south to the port, past the same fields where the flood had left its scars. The sun rose behind us, turning the fences into gold lines. At Galveston, ships waited like gray monuments. Each bore the same white star on its hull, symbols of power now turned toward mercy. On the deck, women wept as the coastline thinned to a pale ribbon. I stood apart, watching the water churn. The smell of diesel mixed with salt and memory. Somewhere between the waves, I realized the sentence that had ruled my life, "Do everything right and life won't fall apart," had inverted itself. Things fell apart, and that was how life moved forward. Months later, in Dresden, a letter arrived. The envelope was stamped with an unfamiliar seal, U.S. War Department. Inside was a form written in 2 languages, and a note in Tom's careful handwriting. "I've petitioned under the new War Bride Act. They said it's possible. If you wish it to, sign and return." I read it twice before understanding. The act had been passed for American soldiers who married foreign women during service. It was bureaucratic, improbable, and entirely human. The form asked questions in numbered order: age, birthplace, marital status, occupation before the war. I filled them in slowly, each answer a bridge between 2 lives that had no right to meet. At the bottom, a blank for relationship to sponsor. I wrote the only word that felt accurate: witness. When I brought the paper to the local Allied office, the clerk, a British sergeant, studied it and asked, half amused, "You fell for a prisoner?" Tom's reply, written in his affidavit, came back to me, "No. I saw a person." Bureaucracy is the language of systems trying to describe miracles. It took a year, signatures, translations, vaccinations, waiting. Then, in the autumn of 1946, I stood again on a pier, this time in New York. The air smelled of coal smoke and salt. He was there. Older, thinner, sun-browned from the farm. When our eyes met, the sound around us dropped away, the gulls, the engines, the crowd. He didn't salute, didn't speak, only held out his hand. I took it. The warmth of that contact said everything paper could not. The harbor wind rose, tugging at my coat, and for the first time since Leipzig, I felt the strange weight of belonging, not to a nation, but to another life earned through disobedience. I had left Germany as a captive. I stepped onto American soil as something unclassified. Not free by law. Free by choice. We settled in Lampasas, a small town folded between low hills and the slow, amber curve of the river. The war had already faded into textbooks and black and white photographs, yet it lived in every silence that followed thunder. Tom built the house himself, 2 rooms, cedar walls, windows facing east. I painted the shutters blue because it was the color I remembered least from Germany. At first, people watched us like a wrong equation they were afraid to solve. The neighbors nodded, smiled politely, and waited to see if the foreign woman would stay. I spoke little. My English came from instruction manuals and guard posts: tool, fence, ration, copy that. It was enough for work, not for belonging. Tom never corrected me, he answered in simple phrases, building our language one shared task at a time. He opened a small bakery behind the house. The sign was a piece of scrap oak, burned by hand, sunny bread. The name was his joke, a German woman baking sunshine. He delivered loaves to stores before dawn, and I handled the ovens. The rhythm returned me to the post office years before: measure, check, repeat. Bread has its own Morse code, the crackle of crust, the hiss of yeast waking in warm water. Every loaf, a message shaped by patience. Children came first, then their mothers. Curiosity outweighed suspicion. They bought brötchen and asked about the accent. I told them it came from the same place as the recipes, somewhere ruined but not erased. By the second year, gossip had softened into routine. The church women still whispered, but they brought empty plates for refills. Sometimes a reporter from the county paper would visit, looking for war stories. He expected tragedy or romance, but we had neither. Just mornings that began before light, fields that browned in drought, and a house that creaked when the wind turned north. When he asked if I felt more German or American, I told him, Texan, with an accent. He laughed, wrote it down, and printed it as the headline. At night, when the bakery cooled, I would sit on the porch and listen to the windmills. Their slow rotation sounded like the old transmitters, steady, circular, eternal. I thought of Harper sometimes, of his exact handwriting on the transport logs, and wondered if he had survived the second crossing to Europe. I never learned. Some people become coordinates you can't recover. Tom kept the harmonica. On quiet evenings, he played the same uncertain melody he had once played outside the barn. It never found an ending. I think he liked it that way, music that keeps walking toward silence but never reaches it. Years passed. The town grew, the bakery thrived. A small sign by the counter read "Good bread, honest work," carved from an old crate that had once carried U.S. Army rations. Tourists came through in the 1950s, drawn by the novelty of "The German Lady Who Stayed." They left with strudel and stories. Once, a man in uniform, too young to remember the war, asked, "Do you ever miss home?" I told him, "Every day. That's how I know I have one." Tom and I never spoke much about what came before. We built forward, plank by plank. But sometimes, when lightning flickered over the fields, I smelled the Atlantic again, the mix of salt, metal, and change. Memory is like static, it fades, but never fully clears. In 1964, after a drought that cracked the earth like old paint, Tom died quietly in his sleep. The town brought flowers. The pastor called him a man who built bridges where fences once stood. I baked bread that morning because the oven still had to be filled. Grief, like dough, requires heat to rise. The years after that blurred into a long afternoon. I kept the bakery open, smaller now, serving coffee to travelers. Children grew into customers. The accent remained. It had become a landmark. When I turned 70, the local paper printed a piece titled "The Woman Who Came in Chains and Stayed for Love." I read it once, then used it to light the stove. The story was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Love was only the visible part. Beneath it ran something quieter, a conviction that the smallest human gestures could rewire entire systems of belief. Sometimes, standing in the yard, I traced the line of the old horizon, flat and endless, and thought of the girl who had crossed an ocean inside a hold of iron. She had arrived bound by orders, by propaganda, by the certainty of being right. She had learned that survival required unlearning almost everything. If anyone asked for advice, I told them, rules are built for peace. Conscience is built for storms. The bakery closed in 1980, when my hands grew too stiff for kneading. But the sign stayed above the door, weathered and faint, "Sunny bread. A life measured in flour and forgiveness." Her gravestone stands on a low hill above Lampasas, half hidden by sunflowers. The stone is simple, unpolished, her name carved without flourish. Anna Schulz Miller, 1919 to 1992. Born in Leipzig, died in Lampasas. Loved both. People bring bread, not flowers. The scent of yeast drifts through the grass, warm as breath. Family remembers another line, one she told her granddaughter during a summer storm. "I arrived here in chains," she said, watching the rain hit the porch steps, "and left free, because once, an enemy handed me a glass of lemonade. The girl asked what it tasted like. Anna smiled, the way only those who have crossed entire worlds can. Like truth, she said. Sweet, but it stings first. And the thunder answered softly, as if agreeing.